Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. May the peace and blessings of God be upon all of you. 1400 years ago, a book was revealed. It was revealed to change the course of human history. Today, it is recited, studied, and memorized by over 1 billion people all across the globe. It is a special book. It is a unique book, which has been memorized cover to cover by millions of individuals all across the world. Its style, its sound, and its message are all beautiful, mesmerizing, and majestic. Unfortunately, due to negative media portrayal and external biases, we have lost this treasure. As part of Islam Awareness Week, IAW, MacMSA presents to you a unique Quran experience, a unique theatrical performance. It is a unique performance that will show you the life and times of the Prophet, peace be upon him, and the Quran. So without further ado, I present to you Experience Quran.
(570 CE Arabia). It had reached the pinnacle of vice, corruption, and oppression. Slavery and mistreatments of slaves was widespread. They would not care for the weak and downtrodden of society. Women were literally inherited as if they were property of men. The society was engrossed in ignorance. Literacy and education were a rarity. They operated based on the tribal code. Constant wars and feuds between tribes for petty differences that would last for centuries. All of this stemming from their true loss of genuine spirituality, the spirituality of their ancestors, Abraham and Ishmael. Instead of striving for a relationship with one God, the most merciful, the most compassionate, the most kind, the most loving, the most just, they created their own idols from their own hands, with their own minds. The problem of idolatry is much deeper than just the creation of images. It is the creation of one's own gods that is symbolic of a person creating his own ideals, his own ethics, his own morals, not being accountable to the true God, whose nature is built by justice, kindness, compassion, and generosity. The moment you turn away from this God and create your own idols, you lose all sense of accountability. You can do whatever you want. And in fact, this is exactly what happened with the Arabian society. They invented their own gods out of stone, and thus they did not feel any remorse with how they oppressed their society and filled it with corruption and darkness.
ما تعبدون من دونه إلا أسماء سميتموها أنتم وآباؤكم ما أنزل الله بها من سلطان إن الحكم إلا لله أمر ألا تعبدوا إلا إياه ذلك الدين القيم ولكن أكثر الناس لا يعلمون.
It was in this time of darkness that Muhammad, peace and blessings be upon him, would come and within a period of 23 years turn the nomadic, wandering, backward Arabs into a golden civilization that would bring Europe out of the dark ages and spread the values of justice, peace, and compassion across the world. The Prophet Muhammad, peace and blessings be upon him, grew up in the ancient city of Mecca and quickly attracted much attention around the city. His character, ethics, and morals were something that stood out, and he earned the title As-Sadiq Al-Amin, the truthful and trustworthy one. His kindness, generosity, and compassion and leadership made him the most beloved of the city. After 14 years living in Mecca, the Prophet Muhammad, peace and blessings be upon him, was troubled by the society, troubled by the state of humanity, troubled by the suffering of the weak and the oppressed. He would often climb atop a mountain on the outskirts of Mecca in order to retreat from society and contemplate, meditate, and think about existential questions. Questions such as, what is the purpose of life? What are we doing here? Who is God? He would go for long periods of time, taking provisions for the journey. And one fateful night, whilst he was meditating, an event occurred that would change his life. It would change the society around him. It would change the Arabian Peninsula. And ultimately, it would change the world. A man had appeared from the darkness. Now just imagine the fear. A figure emerging in the middle of the night, in the dark pitchness of the night, not having heard anyone having climbed the mountain. And he went to the Prophet Muhammad and embraced him with a firm embrace until it was narrated that he could not breathe. And he commanded him to read. Now, literacy was a rarity at the time. And the Prophet Muhammad, peace and blessings be upon him, could not read or write. And so he said, I'm not able to read. This was repeated 3 times with each successive embrace getting harder and harder. And then finally, the first 5 verses of the Quran were revealed.
اقرأ باسم ربك الذي خلق خلق الإنسان من علق اقرأ وربك الأكرم الذي علم بالقلم علم الإنسان ما لم يعلم.
And thus the birth of Islam was marked with 2 commandments. Incredibly, commandments and encouragements to learn, educate, read, gain knowledge. Twice it came as emphasis. This message coming to an ignorant, unlettered people with no civilization, no formal writing script, no schools, no education. But we learn from the first revelation of the Quran that education and knowledge is in fact the source of our nobility as human beings, the purpose of our creation, and that we are to view this world and the universe as a book. One book with one theme, and all the fields of knowledge of science, mathematics, history, sociology, psychology, politics are merely chapters enclosed within the cover of the book of the universe. Read this book, understand the chapters, and understand the underlying theme and message. And that is the theme and message of purpose and meaning. Living life, knowing one's purpose, knowing what one should strive for in this life. The Prophet Muhammad, peace and blessings be upon him, after this bizarre encounter and hearing this supernatural and powerful speech, ran down the mountain straight to the house of his beloved wife, Khadija. It is interesting that the Prophet Muhammad himself narrates the account, and he is not ashamed of his humanity, that after experiencing such an event, it is natural that one feels fear. It is not like false prophets and people who claim communication from God and try to paint the picture as if they were courageous and brave. Had he been a liar and wanted people to respect him more, he would have fabricated such a story, but instead, we see his humanity and the naturalness of what happened. That he ran to his wife and in his fear asked her to cover him with the blanket, console him and comfort him. And then on one occasion, the Prophet Muhammad, puzzled as to what had just occurred, confused, walks outside and he sees an angel. And he would soon learn that this angel is the Archangel Gabriel, filling the horizons. And more verses of the Quran were revealed.
يا أيها المدثر قم فأنذر وربك فكبر وثيابك فطهر والرجز فاهجر ولا تمنن تستكثر ولربك فاصبر.
And thus the saga of Revelation began. The Quran would come down piecemeal, sequentially, one at a time throughout the remaining life of the Prophet Muhammad. And it was at this time in his life, it became clear that he was chosen to receive, communicate, and embody God's message for humanity.
كما أرسلنا فيكم رسولا منكم يتلو عليكم آياتنا ويزكيكم ويعلمكم الكتاب والحكمة ويعلمكم ما لم تكونوا تعلمون.
What was this message? It was a revolutionary message for its time. It was a message that challenged the wrongs of the society. It was a message that gave rights to the oppressed, weak, and downtrodden of society. It gave rights to women at a time that they were seen as property. Daughters were seen as a curse, and some would even go as far as to bury their own baby daughters alive. One of the earliest calls in the Quran was to the abolishment of this practice of infanticide.
ويجعلون لله البنات سبحانه ولهم ما يشتهون وإذا بشر أحدهم بالأنثى ظل وجهه مسودا وهو كظيم يتوارى من القوم من سوء ما بشر به أيمسكه على هون أم يدسه في التراب ألا ساء ما يحكمون.
In a society that was entrenched in the practice of slavery, in fact, it was the economic backbone of the Arab people, Islam came to give rights to the slaves, not allowing anyone to call their slave a slave, ensuring that they were fed, clothed, and treated just as a person would treat their own family, and of course, encouraged to the highest degree the freeing of slaves, and it created a system that would lead to the abolishment of this institution. In fact, the first step in the path and journey to God was described as freeing slaves.
لقد خلقنا الإنسان في كبد أيحسب أن لن يقدر عليه أحد يقول أهلكت مالا لبدا أيحسب أن لم يره أحد ألم نجعل له عينين ولسانا وشفتين وهديناه النجدين فلاقتحم العقبة وما أدراك ما العقبة فك رقبة أو إطعام في يوم ذي مسغبة يتيما ذا مقربة أو مسكينا ذا متربة ثم كان من الذين آمنوا وتواصوا بالصبر وتواصوا بالمرحمة.
The Quran did not just come for social reform. In fact, the primary reform the Quran focuses on is spiritual reform. But we understand that what we call social reform, activism, helping others, standing for social justice, is actually grounded in spirituality. The Quran came with a framework, an understanding, a worldview, and a theology that encompassed all that is good and built its foundation in a relationship with the divine. It is not possible to speak of good and bad without a purpose outlined. What is good and bad if there is no purpose in life? Think about a game. How do we use the words good and bad? We use it to describe whether a player has done a behavior that has facilitated the purpose of the game. Now imagine a game with no purpose. The words good and bad would become meaningless. There's no such thing as good and bad in a game with no purpose. Similarly, there's no such thing as good and bad in life when there is no purpose. What is the purpose? Who decides the purpose? How do I know that there is a purpose?
أفحسبتم أنما خلقناكم عبثا وأنكم إلينا لا ترجعون.
The purpose of anything in this world is determined by the one who designed it and created it and owns it. If you want to know the purpose of something, you simply ask the maker or the owner. Similarly, to know the purpose of your life, ask the one who created and fashioned you.
وما خلقت الجن والإنس إلا ليعبدون ما أريد منهم من رزق وما أريد أن يطعمون إن الله هو الرزاق ذو القوة المتين.
Our purpose in life is to worship God. And do not think worshiping God is confined to prayer in a mosque or holy place. Worship in Islam is much deeper. Worship in Islam is as broad as life itself. Worship is diverse, just like the diversity of our personalities, of our languages, of our races. Worship is submitting oneself to God and thus achieving true freedom from this world. If one does not submit to the transcendent, then he will submit to something in this world, whether it be wealth, fame, social pressure, or even one's own self.
أرأيت من اتخذ إلهه هواه أفأنت تكون عليه وكيلا أم تحسب أن أكثرهم يسمعون أو يعقلون إنهم إلا كالأنعام بل هم أضل سبيلا.
Worship is about knowing God and building your knowledge of God. This knowledge is something which is built through many ways. Firstly, it is built through education. As we have seen, it is the first commandment in the Quran. Secondly, knowledge is built through moral growth. As a person develops his compassion, love, kindness, and generosity, striving for peace and justice, helping others, then in fact they are adorning their character with the attributes of God. As he feeds the poor and develops his character, as he feeds the poor and develops his generosity, as he takes to the streets to protest racial inequality and develops his sense of justice, and as he forgives his family and friends for the wrongs that he was done to and develops his forgiveness, he is gaining knowledge of the most generous, the most just, and the most forgiving. This is why righteousness in Islam is not just ritual acts of prayer, but is built on becoming a better person and helping build one's communities.
ليس البر أن تولوا وجوهكم قبل المشرق والمغرب ولكن البر من آمن بالله واليوم الآخر والملائكة والكتاب والنبيين وآتى المال على حبه ذوي القربى واليتامى والمساكين وابن السبيل والسائلين وفي الرقاب وأقام الصلاة والموفون بعهدهم إذا عاهدوا والصابرين في البأساء والضراء وحين البأس أولئك الذين صدقوا وأولئك هم المتقون.
Worship is a way of life. It is a commitment to embody and spread the values of love, mercy, justice, kindness, and compassion throughout the world. Worshipping God is done through many ways in Islam. Each one brings awareness of God to the heart and develops character within the soul. The prayer, fasting, pilgrimage, charity are all unique methods of worshipping God, where a person learns different lessons from each act of worship. The prayer teaches discipline, concentration, and filling one's heart with the remembrance of God.
أتل ما أوحي إليك من الكتاب وأقم الصلاة إن الصلاة تنهى عن الفحشاء والمنكر ولذكر الله أكبر والله يعلم ما تصنعون.
The charity teaches generosity. The fasting of food from sunrise to sunset for the whole Islamic month of Ramadan teaches self-control and gratitude. The pilgrimage symbolizes one's pilgrimage and journey through life towards God and an understanding of the equality of man. On the plains of the deserts of the pilgrimage, everyone is wearing the same garment. No rich person is distinguished from the poor, and no race over another. All in the brotherhood and sisterhood of humanity, beseeching and answering the call of their Lord. As we see, Islam and the relationship with God forms the basis for all that is good in life. All of the values we instinctively love. We don't need anyone to tell us that love is good, peace is good, justice is good, compassion is good. We know it and we strive for it. This message, as many of you may be thinking, is nothing new. It is a standard message of devotion to God and striving to reach our full potential. And in fact, the Quran never claimed to be anything new at all. It claimed to be part of the legacy of prophethood and messengers that came before it with the same message.
وتلك حجتنا آتيناها إبراهيم على قومه نرفع درجات من نشاء إن ربك حكيم عليم ووهبنا له إسحاق ويعقوب كلا هدينا ونوحا هدينا من قبل ومن ذريته داود وسليمان وأيوب ويوسف وموسى وهارون وكذلك نجزي المحسنين وزكريا ويحيى وعيسى وإلياس كل من الصالحين وإسماعيل واليسع ويونس ولوطا وكلا فضلنا على العالمين ومن آبائهم وذرياتهم وإخوانهم واجتبيناهم وهديناهم إلى صراط مستقيم.
And prophethood is not limited to these names. In fact, we know that there were over hundreds of thousands of prophets, as every single human civilization before the Prophet Muhammad, peace and blessings be upon him, was sent a messenger to communicate this message.
ولقد بعثنا في كل أمة رسولا أن اعبدوا الله واجتنبوا الطاغوت فمنهم من هدى الله ومنهم من حقت عليه الضلالة فسيروا في الأرض فانظروا كيف كان عاقبة المكذبين.
The Quran came as the final message in a long history of communication from God to confirm what was sent before and to correct any errors and deviations that were introduced by the hands of man. What did people change? What did they corrupt? It is human nature to look for shortcuts, intermediaries, middlemen. The human being does not wish to be accountable before God, and so he often creates barriers between him and God so that he will not have to be accountable for his behavior and his character and how he lived his life. The Quran came down to remove these false middlemen and to affirm that there is accountability. God is just, and it would not be just for God to allow criminality on this earth, offenses of the tyrants, dictators, genocidal maniacs, without holding them to account. This accounting will occur at the end of time, when this reality is destroyed and when human life will cease. At this time, everyone will be resurrected from their graves and be brought back to life and will then be judged by God according to how they lived their life in this world. The Quran describes this event in vivid detail, and it is a source of motivation for us to live our life with purpose and meaning, and a deterrent from falling into criminality and evil.
فإذا نفخ في الصور نفخة واحدة وحملت الأرض والجبال فدكتا دكة واحدة فيومئذ وقعت الواقعة وانشقت السماء فهي يومئذ واهية والملك على أرجائها ويحمل عرش ربك فوقهم يومئذ ثمانية يومئذ تعرضون لا تخفى منكم خافية فأما من أوتي كتابه بيمينه فيقول هاؤم اقرءوا كتابيه إني ظننت أني ملاق حسابيه فهو في عيشة راضية في جنة عالية قطوفها دانية كلوا واشربوا هنيئا بما أسلفتم في الأيام الخالية وأما من أوتي كتابه بشماله فيقول يا ليتني لم أوت كتابيه ولم أدر ما حسابيه يا ليتها كانت القاضية ما أغنى عني ماليه هلك عني سلطانيه خذوه فغلوه ثم الجحيم صلوه ثم في سلسلة ذرعها 70 ذراعا فاسلكوه إنه كان لا يؤمن بالله العظيم ولا يحض على طعام المسكين فليس له اليوم هاهنا حميم ولا طعام إلا من غسلين لا يأكله إلا الخاطئون.
This was the message that the Prophet Muhammad, peace and blessings be upon him, came with to his people. Bit by bit, the revelation was sent down on topics pertaining to ethics, morality, God, the hereafter, lessons from previous narrations and the stories of previous prophets. The people of Muhammad, peace and blessings be upon him, saw this message at odds with their way of life and rejected it violently and with vulgarity, cursing those who chose to follow him and physically beating the weak amongst the Muslims. For 13 years, the abuse continued. the Prophet Muhammad, peace and blessings be upon him, remained in Mecca despite the torture and persecution that ensued. The Muslims were commanded to be patient.
وعباد الرحمن الذين يمشون على الأرض هونا وإذا خاطبهم الجاهلون قالوا سلاما فوربك لنسألنهم أجمعين عما كانوا يعملون فاصدع بما تؤمر وأعرض عن المشركين ولقد نعلم أنك يضيق صدرك بما يقولون فسبح بحمد ربك وكن من الساجدين واعبد ربك حتى يأتيك اليقين.
After 13 years, the Prophet Muhammad, peace and blessings be upon him, and his followers were driven and forced out of the city of Mecca, and they sought refuge in the city of Medina. The people of Medina welcomed the Muslims and were happy to receive this new faith. The Medinan city had Christians, Jews, and pagans. They all accepted the Prophet Muhammad as the leader of the city, and the pagans even embraced the faith. And thus the first Muslim society was born. And the Prophet Muhammad, peace and blessings be upon him, prepared a constitution that upheld the rights of the other faiths and allowed them to govern according to their own laws and customs. Thus we see a civilization born in the city of Medina, and it accepted other religions and allowed all faiths to live in mutual coexistence. This was the birth of the Islamic civilization that would become the superpower of the world in less than 23 years, an unprecedented feat in human history. The Prophet Muhammad remained in Medina for 10 years before passing away. It is during this time, in the early period of the Medinan phase of the Prophet's life, that the people of Mecca waged war against them. And thus, you have revelation that came down for the context of the war against the Meccans who were fighting against the Muslims. The Muslims were allowed to defend themselves.
أذن للذين يقاتلون بأنهم ظلموا وإن الله على نصرهم لقدير الذين أخرجوا من ديارهم بغير حق إلا أن يقولوا ربنا الله ولولا دفع الله الناس بعضهم ببعض لهدمت صوامع وبيع وصلوات ومساجد يذكر فيها اسم الله كثيرا ولينصرن الله من ينصره إن الله قوي عزيز.
After years of battle, the Muslims gained victory. And when the Prophet Muhammad returned to Mecca after 8 years of being expelled from it, he did not destroy the city. He did not pillage it. He did not extract any revenge. He granted safety to the people and allowed them to live. The same people who tortured and beat him and his followers for 13 years, the same people who came with armies upon armies to exterminate them, the Prophet Muhammad, peace and blessings be upon him, showed his compassion and mercy as God described him appropriately.
وما أرسلناك إلا رحمة للعالمين.
The Arabian Peninsula then had time during peace to consider the message of Islam, and they embraced it, realizing the error of their ways in the past, realizing the values that Islam came with, and appreciating those values as ideals to strive for in their life. And thus, within just 23 years, the entire Arabian Peninsula, for the first time in history, was unified into one nation. Tribalism and racism was eliminated, and the only thing that measured a human being's worth was the values that he strove for and the closeness to God that he would seek. The Prophet Muhammad received the final revelations from God, and the book of the Quran was completed with the final verse, a verse that would remind the human being of the final day.
واتقوا يوما ترجعون فيه إلى الله واتقوا يوما ترجعون فيه إلى الله ثم توفى كل نفس ما كسبت وهم لا يظلمون.
After the mission of the Prophet Muhammad, peace and blessings be upon him, was complete, to inform mankind of their purpose in life, to inform them of what they should be striving for, and to warn them of the day of accountability where they will be judged before God, he was taken away from this world. It was a dark day in Medina, as it marked the day that direct and consistent communication between God and man had been cut. It marked the day that the greatest human being had left the earth. But his legacy lives on. His message lives on. And as one of his companions proclaimed to the people on the day of his death, whoever worshipped Muhammad, know that he has died. But whoever worships God, know that he is ever living and will never die.
وما محمد إلا رسول قد خلت من قبله الرسل أفإن مات أو قتل انقلبتم على أعقابكم ومن ينقلب على عقبيه فلن يضر الله شيئا وسيجزي الله الكافرين.
I say to you this evening what the revelation of the Quran started with. Read, learn about the world, learn about Islam, delve deeper into the deep questions of life, and do not go through this life just living for the dollar, living for fame, or living for nothing. Live life with purpose, with meaning. Live life for God.
قل إن صلاتي ونسكي ومحياي ومماتي لله رب العالمين لا شريك له وبذلك أمرت وأنا أول المسلمين.
May God bless every one of you here, and may He send His peace and blessings upon the Prophet Muhammad and all of the messengers before him. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuhu.